late to plant? Not for these July crops. You walked past the garden this morning with your coffee, and you did the thing again. You looked at that empty row where the peas gave out in June. You looked at the bare patch where you meant to put in a second round of lettuce back in May, and you felt it. That small, specific guilt that only gardeners know. The season is getting away from you. Maybe you told yourself, well, that's it for this year. I'll try again next spring. I want you to stop saying that, because it isn't true. If you've been gardening for 20, 30, 40 years, you already know something the seed catalogs never quite say out loud. The calendar on the wall is not the calendar your garden actually runs on. And July, the month most people write off as too late, is quietly one of the best planting windows of the entire year, for crops most people never think to plant right now. By the end of this video, you're going to know exactly what to put in the ground this week, why it works even in July heat, and how to do it in a way that's easy on your back, your knees, and your schedule. No tilling a new bed, no fighting weeds all August. Just a short list of crops that reward you with a real harvest before the first frost. Stay with me. The best one on this list, the one almost nobody plants in July, and should, is coming near the end. Here's the thing almost nobody explains clearly. Spring planting and fall planting are not the same skill, and they're not governed by the same clock. In spring, you're racing the last frost. In midsummer, you're racing something completely different. The first frost of autumn, which is often 70, 90, even 120 days away depending on where you garden. That's not a narrow window. That's an entire second growing season, hiding in plain sight. The reason most gardeners miss it isn't lack of knowledge, it's habit. You plant in spring because that's when the excitement is. By July, attention drifts to harvesting tomatoes, fighting squash bugs, and keeping things alive in the heat. Nobody's thinking about planting anything new, which is exactly why the gardeners who do it get a second harvest nobody else on the block has. And there's a second reason. July planting can actually be easier on you than spring planting. The soil is already warm, already worked, already has irrigation habits established. You're not starting from scratch. You're using a bed that's already proven itself this year. If you've gardened long enough to have a bad knee, a bad back, or simply less patience for kneeling in cold spring mud, July is, honestly, the friendlier season to plant in. Warm soil, established beds, no fighting the ground. So let's get into exactly what goes in the ground now, starting with the easiest one on the list. Item 1. Bush beans. If you only plant one thing from this list, make it bush beans. Here's the claim, and I mean this plainly. A properly timed July planting of bush beans will very often outproduce your spring planting. Not because the plant is different, because July beans avoid the exact problem that ruins spring beans almost every year. Cool, wet soil that rots seed before it ever sprouts. Bush beans need warm soil to germinate reliably. Ideally soil that's been sitting in real summer heat for weeks already. That's not a spring condition. That's a July condition. You're planting into exactly the soil temperature this seed evolved to germinate in. Most bush bean varieties mature in 50 to 65 days from seed. Count backward from your average first fall frost date, and in most of the continental U.S., you've got plenty of runway if you plant within the first 2 to 3 weeks of July. Practically, here's what to do. Direct sow seed an inch deep, water it in well, and keep the soil consistently moist for the first week. That's the only fussy part. No trellising needed for bush varieties, no staking, no bending to tie anything up. You plant sitting on a garden stool if you need to, and you're done in 10 minutes. The bonus nobody mentions, a July bean planting tends to produce in the cooler, more comfortable weeks of late August and September, which means you're out picking beans in pleasant evening light instead of crouched in July's worst heat. But beans are the easy one. The next item on this list is the one that actually confuses people because everyone assumes it's a spring-only crop. It isn't. Item 2. Bush cucumbers. Here's a claim that surprises even experienced gardeners. Your best cucumber harvest of the year can come from a July planting, not your May one. Why? Cucumber beetles and powdery mildew build up steadily over a long spring-planted season. By midsummer, a May-planted cucumber vine is often exhausted, spotted, and declining, right as beetle pressure peaks. A fresh July planting sidesteps almost the entire disease curve. It's growing into a garden where the beetle population is already starting to decline as the season turns. Cucumbers need warmth to germinate well, generally wanting soil in the mid-70s or warmer, which again is exactly what July gives you without any effort. Most varieties mature in 50 to 70 days, which puts a July-planted cucumber right on schedule for a clean September harvest. If bending to tend a sprawling vine is hard on your back, look specifically for a bush or compact variety. They're bred to stay contained in a 2 to 3 foot mound instead of running 6 feet across the garden, and they do beautifully in a large container on a table or raised bed edge, right at a height where you're not stooping at all. Bonus: a September cucumber harvest tends to be crisper and less bitter than a July harvest because the plant isn't stressed by peak heat while it's fruiting. You get a better cucumber for less work. Now, if beans and cucumbers surprised you, the next item is going to change how you think about your entire fall garden. Item 3. Beets. Beets are, quietly, one of the most forgiving crops you can plant in July, and one of the most rewarding, because you get 2 harvests from one planting, the greens and the root. Beet seed germinates reliably in warm soil, and the plant actually prefers to mature as temperatures cool, which means a July sowing lines up perfectly with the plant's own preference. Most varieties take 50 to 60 days to a full-size root, but here's the part that matters for anyone who wants a faster payoff. You can start harvesting the tender young greens in as little as 3 to 4 weeks, long before the roots are ready. That's a real, edible harvest in under a month. Direct sow seed a ½ inch deep, about an inch apart, then thin the seedlings once they're a couple of inches tall. Thinning is genuinely the only fiddly part, and even that takes 5 minutes for a whole row. Because beets tolerate light frost without damage. Some say the flavor even improves after a cool night. You're not racing the calendar the way you are with a heat-loving crop. There's real margin for error here, which makes it a forgiving choice if this is your first time trying a midsummer planting. The bonus: beet greens are nutritionally similar to Swiss chard, so even a row you never get around to thinning properly still gives you a legitimate salad crop. Next up is a crop most people only associate with early spring, and one that, planted now, will outperform anything you grew back in April. Item 4. Carrots. Here's the claim. A carrot sown in July, timed correctly, is often sweeter and less woody than a spring-sown carrot, because carrots concentrate sugars as a natural response to cooling fall temperatures. You're not just getting a second chance at carrots, you're getting a better carrot. Carrots take longer than most people expect, commonly 60 to 80 days depending on variety, so this is a don't wait past mid-July crop in most regions. Check your average first frost date and count backward. If you've got 75+ days of growing season left, you have room. The part that trips people up isn't the timing, it's the germination. Carrot seed needs to stay consistently moist for 1 to 3 weeks while it slowly sprouts, and July sun dries out topsoil fast. The fix is simple. Sow the seed, then lay a board, damp burlap, or a thin layer of straw over the row until you see the first green threads emerge, then remove it. That one step solves almost every carrot-growing frustration people have. For anyone who finds deep digging tough on the joints, this is also the moment to mention that carrots grown in a raised bed or a deep container need zero tilling of existing garden soil. You're working with loose, worked soil from the start, which means less resistance and less strain when it's time to harvest. Bonus benefit: carrots left in the ground and mulched heavily after a light frost can often be harvested well into late fall, meaning one July planting can feed you for months, not weeks. If you've stuck with me this far, you already understand more about midsummer planting than most gardeners twice as experienced. That tells me something about you. You're not the kind of gardener who gives up on a season just because a calendar page turned. That's exactly the kind of gardener this next section is for. Before we get to the next crop, tell me in the comments, what zone are you gardening in, and what's the one thing you assumed was too late for this year? I read every one of these, and I promise you, more often than not, it isn't too late at all. And if this is giving you a little bit of hope for the back half of your gardening year, do me a favor and hit subscribe, not for me, for the next person scrolling past this video who's about to give up on their garden a full 3 months too early. Every subscribe tells this platform to put this information in front of more gardeners who need to hear it. Item 5. Swiss chard and kale. This next one is less a single crop and more a category. The cut and come again greens. And Swiss chard and kale are the two most reliable members of that family for a July planting. Here's why this pairing earns its own item. Both plants tolerate heat far better than lettuce, and both actually improve in flavor after a cool night. Which means a July planting gives you a plant that's productive through the worst of late summer and sweeter through the fall. You are, in effect, planting a crop that gets better as the year gets harder. Kale typically reaches usable size in 50 to 65 days. Swiss chard is similar, often a touch faster for baby leaves. Direct sow 1/4 to 1/2 inch deep. And here's the technique that matters most for anyone gardening with less energy to spare. Harvest by cutting outer leaves, not pulling the whole plant. Done this way, a single planting keeps producing for weeks, sometimes months, instead of giving you one harvest and being finished. That's less replanting, less bending to sow new rows, and more food from the same effort. Both plants also handle a light frost with no damage at all, and kale in particular is often described as tasting best after a frost. Once cold weather converts some of its starches to sugar. The bonus: chard and kale are two of the most nutrient-dense vegetables you can grow, and because you're harvesting a few leaves at a time, rather than an entire head, there's very little waste. You take exactly what you'll eat this week, and leave the rest growing. Now, we're closing in on the final stretch of this list, and I want to pause here, because the next item is the one I get the most disbelief about. People genuinely argue with me about this one in the comments every single time. So let's settle it. Item 6. Summer squash and zucchini, second round. Here's the claim people push back on. If your spring zucchini is starting to look tired, spotted, or slowing down, which happens to almost everyone by midsummer, a fresh July planting will outproduce it for the rest of the season. Not help it along. Replace it and do better. The reason is squash vine borers and powdery mildew. Both build up over the life of a plant. A spring-planted squash that's 5 or 6 weeks old by July is often already carrying borer damage or mildew that will only get worse. A brand new July seedling starts clean, and with 45 to 55 days to maturity for most summer squash varieties, it has plenty of time to produce a full second wave of harvest before frost. Direct sow 1 inch deep in warm soil. Squash germinates fast in July heat, often within a week. And if space or bending is a concern, know that bush-type zucchini varieties stay compact enough for a large container or the corner of a raised bed. No sprawling vine required. The practical tip that saves the most heartache: pull the old, declining spring plant out entirely before putting in the new one. Don't let a struggling plant limp along next to a healthy one. It's competing for water and light it doesn't need, and it's likely harboring the very pests you're trying to avoid. Bonus: a July-planted squash tends to fruit through the cooler, more pleasant weeks of September, which for a lot of gardeners means finally enjoying zucchini season without standing in 95-degree heat to pick it. We are almost there. I've saved the best one for last, and I mean that. This is the crop that most people are certain is impossible in July, and it is, without question, the most rewarding thing on this entire list. If you've made it this far in the video, you're clearly someone who still wants a real season out of your garden, not just a spring hobby that quietly fades by August. That's rarer than it should be. Stick around for one more, because this last one is the one I'd plant even if I could only choose one thing from this whole list. Quick favor before the final item: if you know someone who already told you this year, well, my garden's basically done, send them this video. Not the whole thing if you don't want to, just this next part. It might be the difference between them having a fall harvest or an empty garden for 3 more months. Final item: garlic beds. Prep now for an October planting. Here's the one that surprises people most. Garlic isn't planted in July, but the bed for your garlic, the single highest return crop most home gardeners ever grow, should be prepared right now, in July, if you want an effortless planting in October and a harvest next summer that will genuinely spoil you for grocery store garlic forever. Most gardeners wait until fall, scramble to find a clear bed, dig into compacted soil, and plant garlic into ground that's had zero preparation. The gardeners who get spectacular garlic, bulbs the size of a fist, easy to peel, intensely flavorful, are almost always the ones who did one quiet thing back in July. They cleared and started conditioning the bed months in advance. Here's the practical version, and it's genuinely light work. As any of the crops above finish out their bed later this fall, or if you have a spare bed sitting idle right now, clear it of weeds and old plant debris, then top it with 2 to 3 inches of compost or aged manure. Let it sit through the rest of summer. You're not planting anything yet. You're letting the soil biology do slow, quiet work all on its own, breaking that organic matter down into exactly the kind of rich, loose soil garlic cloves want to root into. No tilling required. No physical strain at all, really. Just cover it and walk away. Come October, when you plant individual cloves into that rested, enriched bed, you'll notice immediately how little resistance there is. The soil practically opens for the clove. That ease in October is the direct payoff of the 10 minutes of work you do in July. And the reward for that patience is real. Garlic planted in fall sits quietly through winter, sends up green shoots as soon as the ground warms, and rewards you with a harvest the following summer that home gardeners consistently describe as completely different from anything sold in a store. Sweeter, more complex, and lasting in storage for months. This is why I saved it for last. Everything else on this list feeds you in the next few weeks. This one is a gift you're giving your garden a year from now, and there is something genuinely satisfying about a July gardener disciplined enough to plant for a harvest that far ahead. So let's go back to where we started. That walk past the garden this morning, looking at the bare patches and feeling like the season had already slipped past you. It hasn't. Not even close. You now know that bush beans planted this week will likely outproduce your spring crop. That cucumbers sown now will dodge the disease pressure that wrecked your May planting. That beets and carrots planted right now will come out sweeter for having grown through the cooling weeks of fall. That chard and kale planted today will keep feeding you in small, steady harvests for months. That your tired spring squash can be pulled and replaced with a clean, productive planting that fruits right through September. And that 10 quiet minutes in a garlic bed this month sets up a harvest that will still be feeding you a full year from now. Here's what I'd actually do this week, in order. Pick one bed that's empty or finishing up, clear it, and put in either bush beans or bush cucumbers. They're the fastest, easiest wins on this list. Then, this weekend, prep one more bed the same way for beets or carrots. If you do nothing else from this whole video, do those 2 things, and you will have a garden in September that most of your neighbors will assume you started weeks ago. Now I want to hear from you. Of everything on this list, which one are you most surprised to learn you can still plant? Tell me in the comments, and if you're already planning where it's going in your garden this week, say that too. I read every single comment on these videos, and I want to know what you're putting in the ground. And if this video gave you back even one crop you thought you'd lost for the year, subscribe. Not just for today, because I've got the full fall planting calendar coming next, region by region, and you're going to want to be here for it. Your garden isn't done for the year. It's just getting started on its second act. I'll see you in the next one.